Bay of Biscay, March 25, 1940, 0930. Hours and Captain Lieutenant Werner Hankey stood in the conning tower of 976 watching his lookout scan the clouded morning sky, confident that 60 cm of seawater above his pressure hull would deflect any Allied cannon shells if they crash-dived. Completely unaware that two Royal Air Force Mosquito FB Mark 18 aircraft approaching from the northeast carried 57mm guns specifically designed to punch through submarine hulls even when submerged, their 6-hull bomber-piercing shells capable of maintaining lethal velocity through 2 full feet of water at 1,400 meter range. The Marine had trained Hankey and every U-boat commander that immediate crash diving offered absolute protection from aerial cannon fire, teaching them that water's density would rob any projectile of its kinetic energy within centimeters, making a meter of seawater better armor than steel plate. Yet this morning near St. Nazaire, the doctrine would prove catastrophically wrong when Flight Officer Turner's Mosquito aircraft serial HX-93 item lined up for its attack run at precisely the angle and altitude that British Coastal Command had perfected over months of testing, the pilot holding his twin-engine fighter-bomber steady as his navigator prepared to unleash something the German submarine force had never encountered before. 20 minutes earlier, Hankey's hydrophone operator had reported multiple aircraft engines to the north, prompting standard defensive procedures that had saved dozens of U-boat since 1943. With the crew manning their twin 20mm flak guns and the new 37mm cannon they'd installed at Loria just 2 weeks ago, weapons that made Allied pilots think twice about pressing home attacks. Except these approaching Mosquitoes weren't carrying the usual rockets or depth charges that you gunners had learned to counter, but instead mounted a weapon system that Reich's Marshal Göring himself had dismissed as British propaganda when intelligence reports first mentioned it in late 1943. The 57mm Molins gun, technically designated QF 6-pounder clear class M1 without a load of their Mark 3 by the Royal Air Force, represented a convergence of technologies that German aval designers had considered but rejected as impossible to implement effectively, combining a modified anti-tank gun with an automatic feeding mechanism developed by a British cigarette-making machinery company, creating a weapon system that could fire 55 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 890 mph specifications that Donut's technical staff at BDU headquarters refused to believe when captured. Allied aircrew first described them under interrogation. Hankey had survived 37 war patrols since 1940, sinking 11 Allied merchant vessels totaling 62,000 tons, earning the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, learning through bitter experience how to counter every Allied anti-submarine weapon from the early British depth charges that detonated too shallow to the American acoustic homing torpedoes they called PH-TOW that forced U-boat to release decoy noisemakers. Yet nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for an aircraft-mounted cannon that could engage his submarine effectively from outside the range of his defensive armament, delivering armor-piercing shells at velocities that treated seawater not as a protective barrier, but merely as a minor ballistic inconvenience. The concept seemed to violate everything German engineers understood about fluid dynamics and projectile physics, which held that water's density, 800 times greater than air, would destabilize and deflect any projectile within the first few centimeters of penetration. Yet British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had discovered through methodical testing that a properly shaped projectile maintaining sufficient velocity could indeed penetrate significant depths of water while retaining lethal kinetic energy, a finding that would have revolutionized marine defensive doctrine if anyone at U-boat command had believed it possible. As Turner's Mosquito descended from 1,500 meters in a 30-degree dive, precisely as prescribed in Coastal Command's tactical manual, Hankey's lookouts finally spotted the approaching aircraft, their shouts of Mosquito bearing 435 sending the anti-aircraft gunners spinning their weapons toward the threat, though the extreme range meant their 20mm shells would fall harmlessly into the sea hundreds of meters short while the 37mm gun crew struggled to elevate their weapons sufficiently to engage an aircraft approaching from such a steep angle limitations that RAF intelligence had carefully catalogued through analysis of previous engagements. The Mosquito's wooden construction, which Luftwaffe pilots had mocked as furniture with engines when they first encountered it in 1941, now proved advantageous in ways German tacticians hadn't anticipated, absorbing flak damage that would aluminum aircraft, while providing a surprisingly stable gun platform for the massive Molins installation that occupied the entire lower nose section, where 4 20mm Spano cannons would normally be mounted, a trade-off that Coastal Command considered worthwhile, given the weapon's devastating effectiveness against maritime targets. Flight Officer Turner lined up his gun sight using the twin 303 Browning machine guns as ranging weapons, their tracers walking across the water toward 976 Conning Tower, while his navigator monitored the dive angle and airspeed, calling out corrections to maintain the precise attack parameters that would ensure their 57mm shell struck at the optimal angle for penetration, a procedure they'd rehearsed dozens of times against target hulks in the waters of Scotland, but were now executing in earnest against a veteran U-boat crew fighting for survival. The first 57mm shell left the Molins gun at 09:37 hours and 12 seconds, followed by 5 more in rapid succession as the automatic loader functioned flawlessly, despite the G-forces of the diving attack. Each 6LB projectile traveling the 1,400 meters tow target in less than 2 seconds, their trajectory calculated to strike the submarine's pressure hull just forward of the conning tower, where intelligence indicated the control room and officers' quarters were located. Targeting the nerve center of the U-boat's operations, Hankey had perhaps 3 seconds to process what he was seeing. The large caliber tracers approaching at a velocity Heiss experienced, I told him, was impossible for aircraft armament. Before ordering the crash dive that doctrine assured him would save his boat, the lookout stumbling down the hatch as the diving klaxon howled through 976 compartments, the diesel engines cutting off as the electric motors engaged and the bow planes drove the submarine's nose beneath the surface, actions executed with the precision of hundreds of previous drills. Yet this time, the protective embrace of the sea would prove illusory. The first shell struck the water 20 mi ahead of the crash-diving submarine, its specially hardened armor-piercing warhead, maintaining stability through the liquid medium exactly as British ballisticians had calculated. The projectile's velocity decreasing from 890 to approximately 600 mph, but still carrying more than sufficient energy to penetrate the pressure hull's 19mm steel plating, while the second and third shells followed milliseconds behind, creating a pattern of impacts that bracketed the submarine's estimated position beneath the surface. Inside 976, the engineering officer was just securing the diesel exhaust valves when the first 57mm shell punched through the pressure hole near frame 47. The sudden, catastrophic decompression in the forward torpedo room, creating a sound like thunder as the sea rushed through a hole the size of a man's fist, while fragments of the shell's steel jacket ricocheted through the compartment, killing 2 torpedo mechanics instantly and wounding 3 others who'd been preparing tubes 1 and 2 for a practice drill. The second shell penetrated 6 ml raft, destroying the attack periscope housing and flooding the control room with a cascade of seawater mixed with hydraulic fluid from the severed periscope training mechanism, while Hankey struggled to maintain his footing on the increasingly angled deck plates, shouting orders to blow all ballast tanks even as he realized the catastrophic nature of the damage. Water already ankle-deep around the navigation table, where his charts of the French coastal waters were dissolving into pulp. The impossible had happened. Armor-piercing shells had maintained their integrity and velocity through the water barrier that every commander since 1939 had considered inviolate, proving that the British had developed a weapon system specifically designed to exploit what the CRE Marine had always considered their submarine's greatest tactical advantage: the ability to disappear beneath the sea's protective surface at the first sign of aerial threat, a capability that had saved countless U-boat from destruction during 4 years of increasingly intense aerial patrols. Turner's Mosquito pulled out of its dive at 300 mt, the pilot fighting the controls as the recoil from the Molins gun had pushed the aircraft slightly off its attack axis, while his wingman flying officer Hilliard an aircraft, MM-425, Love lined up for his own attack run. Though it was already evident that 976 was mortally wounded, oil and debris spreading across the surface where the submarine had disappeared. The characteristic signs of a pressure hull breach that every coastal command pilot had been trained to recognize. The second Mosquito's attack proved unnecessary but devastating. Hilliard's 6 rounds of 57mm ammunition striking the water in a tight pattern around the oil slick. At least 2 shells finding the submarine's hull as it struggled at a depth of 15 main, the additional damage destroying any possibility of emergency surfacing. While inside 976, Hankey ordered all hands to abandon ship through the forward torpedo loading hatch, the only escape route still accessible as the after compartments flooded with tons of seawater. By 0942 hours, 5 minutes after, the first Molins shell had struck. 976 had settled on the bottom in 27 man-hours of water. Her pressure hull breached in 4 places. 38 of her 52 crew members dead or dying in the flooded compartments, while 14 survivors, including Hankey, struggled to the surface through the torpedo hatch, emerging into a sea covered with oil and debris. Their life jackets keeping them afloat as the 2 Mosquitoes circled overhead, Turner radioing their position to air-sea rescue while maintaining watch for any German naval vessels that might attempt to retrieve the survivors. The action had lasted less than 7 minutes from first sighting to the submarine's destruction, a combat duration that would have seemed impossibly brief to U-boat commanders who endured hours-long depth charge attacks from destroyers and corvettes. Yet the concentrated firepower of the Molins gun had achieved what hundreds of depth charges often failed to accomplish: the confirmed destruction of a modern Type 7 CU boat with all its defensive improvements, including enhanced anti-aircraft armament and radar warning receivers that had proven useless against this new threat. At Carnival, Admiral Donut's headquarters near Laura, the loss of 976 was initially attributed to conventional causes, perhaps a lucky depth charge from a destroyer or a mine in the supposedly cleared channel approaching St. Nazaire until intercepted British radio traffic mentioned Setzi aircraft successful engagement, a reference that sent staff officers scrambling through intelligence files to understand what had happened. Their investigation revealing a weapon system that challenged fundamental assumptions about submarine defensive tactics. The Mosquito FB Mark 18, nicknamed Setzi after the African fly with the devastating bite, had emerged from a British Coastal Command requirement for weapon that could engage you during the brief moments they remained on the surface or at shallow depth, exploiting the gap between when submarines detected approaching aircraft and when they reached safe depth, a vulnerability window that typically lasted 30 to 45 seconds, but which the extended range of the 57mm gun had now extended to nearly 2 minutes. German naval intelligence had first learned of the Molins gun's existence in November 1943, when a damaged Mosquito had made an emergency landing in neutral Spain. Though Spanish authorities had prevented detailed examination of the aircraft, reporting only that it carried an unusually large cannon installation. Intelligence that marine technical experts had dismissed as probably referring to experimental rocket launchers or perhaps a propaganda deception intended to create fear among U-boat crews without basis in actual capability. The reality proved far worse than anything German naval planners had imagined. A weapon system that essentially negated the U-boat's primary defensive advantage while operating at ranges that made counter-fire ineffective, creating what U-boat commanders would soon term toad zone. The death zone that extended from the surface to periscope depth and outward to nearly 2 kilometers from the submarine. A volume of space where U-boats were now vulnerable to instant destruction from an enemy they could barely see and couldn't effectively engage. Captain Lutton Hankey, rescued after 4 hours in the water by a German minesweeper, would spend 3 days being debriefed by incredulous staff officers who struggled to accept his account of armor-piercing shells penetrating his submarine through 2 feet of seawater, with several technical experts insisting he must have been mistaken, that perhaps his boat had struck a mine simultaneously with the aircraft attack until recovery. Divers examining the wreck confirmed the characteristic entry: holes of large-caliber armor-piercing projectiles, evidence that forced a complete reevaluation of defensive doctrine. The technological surprise represented by the Molins gun echoed earlier British innovations that had caught the Kremmerine unprepared. From the cavity magnetron radar that had suddenly made night surface operations suicidal to Thali light that had turned darkness from concealment into a trap. Each advancement progressively stripping away the tactical advantages that had made the U-boat such a formidable weapon in the early war years, forcing submarines to operate under increasingly restrictive conditions that reduced their effectiveness to a fraction of what it had been during the happy times of 1940 and 41. Yet, the Molins gun represented something qualitatively different from previous anti-submarine weapons. Not merely an improvement in existing technology, but a fundamental breakthrough that exploited physics in ways German scientists had considered but dismissed as impractical. The marriage of an anti-tank gun to an aircraft, creating a weapon system that belonged more to the future of warfare than the present, anticipating the precision standoff weapons that would dominate later conflicts but appearing now in 1944, when German forces had no effective counter. The British had solved the technical challenges through methodical experimentation that would have impressed even German engineers, discovering that the key lay not in the projectile's velocity alone, but in its shape and composition. Using a hardened steel penetrator with a carefully calculated ogive that maintained stability through the water column while retaining sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate submarine pressure, Hull's achievements that required precise manufacturing tolerances and specialized ammunition that only British industry could produce in quantity. The automatic loading mechanism designed by Molins Machine Company using principles derived from cigarette manufacturing equipment had overcome the seemingly impossible challenge of feeding 21 rounds of heavy ammunition reliably, while the aircraft maneuvered violently during attack, using a combination of spring pressure and gravity feed that functioned even under negative G-forces, enabling sustained fire that manual loading could never achieve. Transforming the weapon from an interesting experiment into a practical combat system, testing at the Coastal Command Development Unit had revealed optimal attack parameters that maximized hit probability while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire, determining that a 30-degree dive from 1500 m altitude, releasing at 800 m range, provided the best combination of accuracy and survivability. Though these parameters required exceptional piloting skill to maintain while under fire, leading to the selection of only the most experienced Mosquito crews for conversion to the Tetsi variant. The first operational Tetsi Squadron No. 248, squadron based at Pretanac in Cornwall, had begun operations in October 1943 with just 3 modified aircraft, their early missions focusing on reconnaissance and convoy escort, while crews developed tactics for engaging, a learning process that had cost 1 aircraft and crew in November when they pressed an attack too close and were destroyed by concentrated flak fire from Al-Bat Wolfpack, teaching harsh lessons about the weapon's capabilities and limitations. By March 1944, when U-976 met its fate, 48th Squadron had refined its tactics to near perfection, operating in pairs with 1 aircraft, engaging while the other provided cover and spotted the fall of shot, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm submarine defenses while maximizing the probability of achieving hull penetration. Tactics that would claim 6 boats in the spring of 1944 before German submarines largely abandoned daylight surface transits of the Bay of Bisque. The psychological impact on U-boat crews exceeded even the physical destruction as word spread through the submarine bases at Laura, St. Nazaire, Louisiana Palace, and Bordeaux that the British had developed a weapon against which there was no defense except remaining submerged, forcing boats to travel on batteries at slow speed, even in supposedly safe waters, drastically reducing their operational range and time on station, effects that multiplied the weapon's strategic impact far beyond the actual number of submarines destroyed. Oberleutnant Zur C. Friedrich Schilling, commanding U-415, recorded in his war diary on March 28, 3 days after 976 loss. The men are terrified of these cannon-armed mosquitoes, calling them Hull's hammer. Wooden hammers that can strike us even beneath the waves. Morale is suffering as we no longer feel safe at any depth accessible to aircraft attack. The old certainty that crash diving meant survival has been shattered, leaving us naked before this new threat. The German Naval High Command's response reflected both desperation and incomprehension, ordering U-Boat to travel in groups for mutual anti-aircraft protection, a tactic that had failed catastrophically in the summer of 1943, and now proved even more futile against the standoff capability of the 57mm gun, leading to incidents like the March 27th attack on a 5-boat convoy, where Mosquitoes damaged 3 submarines while remaining beyond effective. Flak range, demonstrating the futility of conventional defensive measures. Technical countermeasures proposed by German engineers ranged from the practical to the fantastic, including proposals for armored conning, towers that would have made submarines dangerously unstable to explosive reactive armor that would detonate incoming shells before they penetrated, none of which could be implemented with available resources or within timeframes that mattered, leaving U-Boat essentially defenseless against a weapon that seemed to belong to a different era of warfare entirely. Admiral Donich himself, the architect of U-Boat strategy and tactics since before the war, found himself confronting a technological surprise that invalidated 20 years of submarine doctrine. Writing in his memoirs after the war, the appearance of cannon-armed Mosquitoes capable of destroying submerged U-Boat represented the kind of technological discontinuity we had always feared but never seriously expected, a single innovation that neutralized advantages we had spent years developing and refining. The British had achieved this breakthrough through a combination of factors that German industry could never have replicated by 1944, including access to specialized metallurgy for the armor-piercing projectiles, precision manufacturing capabilities for the autoloader mechanism, and perhaps most importantly, the institutional flexibility to combine technologies from completely different domains, anti-tank warfare and cigarette manufacturing, into a weapon system that no traditional military establishment would have conceived. The Mosquito itself represented everything German military orthodoxy rejected, a wooden aircraft in an age of metal designed by a furniture company rather than an established aircraft manufacturer, powered by engines originally intended for fighters, but adapted to a twin-engine configuration that provided both speed and range, creating a platform that could carry weapons loads thought impossible for its size, while maintaining performance that made it nearly impossible to intercept. Yet it was precisely these unorthodox characteristics that made the Mosquito the perfect platform for the Molins gun, its wooden structure absorbing the massive recoil forces without the metal fatigue that would have destroyed aluminum aircraft. While its twin-engine reliability ensured that crews could complete their attack runs, even if one engine was damaged by flak, advantages that no German aircraft could match even if they had possessed comparable weapons, which they did not and could not develop in time to matter. The Japanese naval attaches in Berlin, Captain Yokoi Tadada, observing the crisis facing their German allies, cabled Tokyo on April 2, 1944. The British have deployed a weapon that negates the submarine's natural advantage, cannon shells that penetrate water as if it were air. Our submarine force must take note, as similar weapons could appear in the Pacific, though the Germans have no solution to offer except prayer and luck, neither of which seems effective against British technology. Indeed, the German response increasingly resembled desperate improvisation, rather than systematic counter-innovation, with proposals including submarine-launched fighters, which were technically impossible, underwater smoke screens, which would have revealed submarine positions, and even acoustic decoys that mimicked submarine engine noise to draw aircraft attacks away from real boats, none of which addressed the fundamental problem that the Molins gun had created: the ability to destroy submarines at ranges where they couldn't fight back. The Italian Navy operating surviving submarines from bases in the eastern Mediterranean after Italy's surrender in September 1943 had transferred 3 boats to German control, which now faced the same threatened the Atlantic with command Dandy Geppi Russo of the former Reggio Marina observing, "We thought the British would eventually develop better depth charges or torpedoes, conventional weapons we understood and could counter. But this cannon that shoots through water like bullets through paper, this is something from science fiction, not naval warfare as we learned it." By April 1944, the impact of the Tsetse mosquitoes had spread throughout the U-boat arm, with boats refusing to surface even for emergency repairs unless absolutely necessary. Crews developing what medical officers diagnosed as mosquito neurosis, an anxiety condition characterized by obsessive scanning of the sky, and reluctance to man bridge watches, symptoms that reflected rational fear rather than psychological weakness given the weapons demonstrated lethality and the impossibility of effective defense. The operational records of Number 248 Squadron showed steadily improving effectiveness as crews gained experience with the weapon, achieving a 41% hit rate by May 1944, compared to less than 5% for conventional rockets, while mechanical reliability of the Molins autoloader exceeded 95% even in combat conditions. Statistics that would have seemed impossible to German engineers, struggling to maintain much simpler weapon systems under the stress of combat operations. Wing Commander William Siss, commanding 248 Squadron, reported to Coastal Command Headquarters. The psychological effect exceeds even the physical destruction. U-boat behavior has changed fundamentally since we began operations. They remain submerged even in conditions where surfacing would be tactically advantageous, accepting reduced speed and range rather than risk exposure to our guns. Effects that multiply our impact beyond the actual number of boats destroyed. The German development of the snorkel breathing apparatus rushed into production, partially in response to the Tsetse threat offered only partial reliefs. The device limited submarines to slow speed and created its own vulnerabilities, including a prominent radar signature and mechanical failures that could leave boats helpless on the surface while doing nothing to protect against. The Molins gun's ability to engage submarines at shallow depth where the snorkel operated. Bergen Captain Gunther Hessler, Donut's son-in-law and chief of operations at U-boat Command, conducted a comprehensive analysis in May 1944, concluding, "The enemy has achieved qualitative superiority through this weapon that no quantitative increase in our forces can overcome. We can build more U-boat, but cannot make them immune to 57mm shells that penetrate water as effectively as air, forcing acknowledgement that the technical initiative has passed irreversibly to the enemy." The Molins gun's effectiveness extended beyond U-boats to surface vessels, demonstrated dramatically on April 5, 1945, when Tsetse mosquitoes attacked a German convoy in the Kattegat, sinking 5 ships, including a spare Breer vessel specifically designed to absorb punishment. The 57mm shells penetrating armor plate that would have defeated conventional aircraft weapons, causing casualties exceeding 200 German naval personnel in an action lasting less than 15 minutes. This versatility had note-scaped German naval planners horrorized that the same weapon threatening their submarines could equally devastate their remaining surface forces, including the torpedo boats and destroyers that provided essential escort for the few blockade runners still attempting to breach the Allied naval blockade. Ships whose armor was designed to resist splinters and small-caliber fire, not dedicated armor-piercing projectiles delivered with sniper-like precision from beyond effective return fire range. The Technical Intelligence Section at Marine Headquarters, studying every available report on the Molins gun, identified numerous theoretical vulnerabilities that proved impossible to exploit in practice, including the weapon's relatively limited ammunition supply of 21 rounds, which still provided more than sufficient firepower to destroy any submarine, and its requirement for a steady attack run, which skilled pilots could complete in less time than it took U-boat gunners to react. Attempts to obtain detailed intelligence through neutral countries proved frustrating, with Swedish observers reporting only that the British have mounted an anti-tank gun in a wooden airplane. Intelligence so absurd-sounding that several German officers were court-martialed for submitting what higher headquarters considered fantasy reports designed to excuse combat failures until photographic evidence from Spanish sources confirmed that the British had indeed achieved what German engineers considered impossible. The Luftwaffe tasked with protecting U-boat boats in the Bay of Biscay found their fighters unable to effectively counter the Tsetse mosquitoes, which possess speed comparable to the Bf 109 and FW 190, while operating under strong fighter escort from conventional Mosquito FB Mark VI aircraft creating packages that could fight through German air defenses to deliver their specialized anti-submarine weapons, reversing the air superiority Germany had enjoyed over the Bay in earlier years. Major Johannes Kaufmann of Jägerschwader II, leading one of the few successful interceptions of its Mosquito in April 1944, reported, "We shot down one after a long chase. Examining the wreckage revealed a weapon of extraordinary sophistication, the gun installation alone weighing more than our entire fighter armament. Yet somehow the British make it work in a wooden aircraft that flies as fast as our best interceptors. Achievements that suggest a technical capability we can no longer match." The Japanese, monitoring these developments with intense interest as they faced increasing American submarine pressure in the Pacific, attempted to obtain technical details through their embassy in Berlin with Admiral Nano Morakabling from Berlin. The German submarine force is being systematically destroyed by a weapon they never imagined possible. We must assume the Americans are developing similar capabilities, though our submarine force lacks even the minimal anti-aircraft defenses of German U-boat, making us even more vulnerable to such weapons should they appear. By June 1944, as Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy, the U-boat force that should have interdicted the invasion fleet remained largely paralyzed in their bases, unwilling to face the combination of conventional anti-submarine forces and the specialized Setzai squadrons that had turned the Bay of Bisque into what survivors called Dirtekorridor, the death corridor where submarines faced annihilation from weapons that seemed to violate the laws of physics as German engineers understood them. The handful of U-boat that did attempt to reach the invasion areas discovered that the Molins gun was merely one element of an integrated anti-submarine system that had evolved far beyond German countermeasures, with radar-equipped aircraft maintaining continuous patrol lines that detected snorkel heads at ranges exceeding 10 meters while surface.